He imagined the room, bathed in blood, himself striding through it, a raven amongst the carcasses, strutting like any carrion king. Nathan Ballingrud, North American Lake Monsters. Welcome to Books in the Freezer, a podcast dedicated to the deliciously disturbing world of horror fiction. I'm your host, Stephanie, and today we have special guest Jason White from Jason's Weird Reads on YouTube and the Darkness Dwells podcast, and we are tackling the subgenre of the weird. Well, welcome to the show, Jason.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, this is a subgenre I've wanted to talk about, and I know it's one that you're passionate about, so I felt like you were the perfect guest for this episode.
Well, again, thank you. I just want to put it out there that I'm not the smartest person within, this genre. There's a lot of the people that I read, in fact, are like, they blow my mind on how much they know about this genre, because I've talked to some of them on my own show. And but yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be talking about this. This is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, thing to read. So
yeah, I remember you saying that. I think it was a video, and one of the questions was like, if you only had to read one genre for the rest of your life, and you said weird.
Yes, that's because there's such a big range of weird fiction. You can still read fantasy. You can still read science fiction. It's very diverse in that way. And horror, of course.
I think it's one of those things when you start getting into horror and you find out that weird is not just a description, like it's an actual subgenre category.
Yeah. Well, the weird thing about weird fiction is that it's kind of hard to define exactly what it is. There's a saying that goes around that you don't know that you're reading weird fiction until you're reading it, and then you're like, oh, this is weird fiction. But it is very much within its own subgenre, but it kind of fits different genres on its own. Does that make any sense?
Kind of. So it's like there is weird within horror, but then horror also falls under the umbrella of weird.
Yes. Mostly because, literary horror often falls into weird horror.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that. Because most, if not all, weird fiction is literary horror. Because it focuses mostly on character rather than plot. Almost always, when you're reading a weird fiction story, it's almost always about the existential dread or the existential experience of the character and what they're going through. And that's where the weird comes in. And that's why you can have like a science fiction story or a fantasy story or any genre, really. All you need to do is add in an element that warps reality in some way and changes the reality of the character. It can even be that the character's insane. It doesn't need to be an actual, like, clashing of dimensions or something like that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But it's because of that uncertainty of what's going on that creates a certain sort of dread. And that dread is really relatable to horror. So it doesn't necessarily need to be horror, but even if it doesn't have any, like, supernatural elements to it, you're still going to read it as a horror story because of what's going on with the character.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because I would say all the books that I picked, I think 2 out of the 3, were very character focused in a way that I really connected with. Because I think a lot of the preconceived notions I have about weird were, one, like, yeah, most of the weird books that I've read were very literary, and some short stories, like to the extent that I just did not understand what was going on. And the minute that I finished them, I'm like, I need someone to just like explain this to me. It just
Yeah,
went totally over my head, whatever it was they were trying to say.
that's definitely one of the things where you know that you're reading weird fiction because you don't know what the hell's going on. And when you finished it, you still don't know. um, and, I think that turns a lot of people off to this subgenre, honestly. And because a lot of people like having things explained. And for me, the reason why I like weird fiction so much is I've always been drawn to that mystery. Like that lady who died at the top of a building. She died in that water reservoir.
Yeah.
And you've seen the YouTube video of that where she's like
Yeah.
looking. She's in the elevator and she's looking, and that's
so creepy.
yeah, it's very creepy. But we don't know what happened, and the door leading to the top of the building was locked. So how did she get out there, and how did she get into the water reservoir thing? And so it's things like that that make my imagination just start spinning, and I'm like, oh, I gotta know what happened, but I don't necessarily want to know what happened, because if you logically explained everything, that would destroy the mystery, and suddenly I'm not interested anymore.
I can see that. So you think there's a bit of ambiguity within weird just naturally?
Because, you can see authors reaching for that ambiguity, and it doesn't always work. I think there has to be a logical thing that is happening in the background. You don't necessarily have to know it, but you can't just do weird for weird. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah.
weird for weird's sake. You need to have, there has to be a reason there. You're just not, if you're the author, you're just not offering what it is. That makes the best weird fiction, in my opinion.
I can see that where it's there like a book that I've mentioned a few times on the podcast, A Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, where it's one of those things where I'm like, I didn't get it, but when I looked it up and had people, give these very detailed explanations, I thought, okay, like that makes sense now that those things were put in context.
Yeah.
I mean, some of those things were very specific to like the setting and the politics of that setting that I just wasn't aware of, but
Yeah.
like when like an English professor finally like tells you what a thing is, and you're like, oh, okay, now it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it has to make sense once it's explained.
Certainly. And sometimes you don't want it explained. You like
Yeah.
your mind sort of wondering. Yeah, it's all about the awe-inspiring moment that doesn't necessarily need an answer. And
So,
that I think, Caitlin or Kiernan, who's one of the books I'm going to be talking about in a bit, she always talks about awe and wonder. And one of her collections, actually, I think is called, or has awe and wonder in the title. I can't remember exactly, but that's really what it comes down to, is that moment of awe and wonder when something happens and you're just left speechless and wondering what the hell just happened. And literary masters of this can use that and turn it into so much symbolism and meaning.
yeah, so I feel like personally a lot of the thing with weird is a lot of the times it's more the journey than the destination. Like I enjoy sometimes reading the novel, even though sometimes by the end I'm like, I don't know if I can really sit down and explain what it all means, but I enjoyed it. It was a great reading experience.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, some of the books that we're going to be discussing today, I can't go much beyond the very basics.
What was it? The one that we talked about earlier? Because I told you, I'm like, I tried to read that and I just did not. I did not get it.
I think that was the Caitlin Kiernan one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
She's actually, I think, the first author I read that was strictly weird fiction, and that's what pulled me in. And so I kind of had to. I haven't read this book that we're going to be discussing until you asked me to be on the show, and then I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to read this novella that she wrote, because it has to come full circle for me in some way.
So I know we talked about like the weird, well, the strange like genre placement of weird, but I feel like there's like smaller subgenres that also fit under weird. Like,
Hmm.
what's the relationship between bizarro and weird fiction?
Well, weird fiction is is what I sort of just described. It's you're taking real life things and you're turning it into something that's surreal.
Mm-hmm.
I think weird fiction really relies on surrealism and existence and what existence means and all that stuff. Where bizarro will take real life and turn it into a cartoon and then throw some dark stuff in there and mess it all up and basically splatter the screen of your eyes with a whole bunch of different types of bodily fluids.
I love that explanation.
Yeah, we're weird fiction is looking for meaning. Bizarro is just sort of having fun with it,
Mm-hmm.
and you can get some very dark Bizarro stories for sure. But it's definitely more absurdist
Yeah.
than weird fiction is. You get a lot of weird, absurd things happening with Bizarro.
And I was also curious about where cosmic horror fits into this, because I know H.P. Lovecraft is, weird and cosmic.
Yeah, and the two are almost married, you could say, because they come from the same place. Cosmic horror existed before H.P. Lovecraft started writing, but he's the one after his death that really capitalized on it. All his
Mm-hmm.
ideas really blew the idea of cosmic horror out of the water. And basically, what cosmic horror is it's weird because of what you're dealing with. But basically, the best way to describe what cosmic horror is looking up at the night sky at night, looking at all the stars, and realizing how vast and how big the universe is, and how insignificant you are in it. And anything that could happen, a rock crashing into the earth and destroying life here, or anything like that, it'll happen without any conscious being caring about what happens to you and your life. So, the basic concept of cosmic horrors are these ancient gods that existed before even Earth. And if they come through here, they're going to wipe us out or they're going to make us their slaves, but they won't even really register. We're less than ants in their world, and there is no God that's going to save you. Life is hopeless. and it's very nihilistic. Let's just
Yes.
leave it at that.
I was going to say, it does sound like they both share some like existential nihilistic roots.
Yes, for sure. But yeah, that's definitely what cosmic horror is. It's basically, and that's why it's called cosmic horror. Because I think it's with the idea of looking out into space from a field somewhere and realizing just how small and insignificant you are, and realizing that there is no God. And it doesn't have to be atheist because obviously there's the old ones, the old gods and whatnot. And with cosmic horror, you often get cults that worship these ancient gods, and that never works out very well. But I guess if you got to try for something, you might as well.
Oh man. Oh, as I was looking through um some of the weird books I had read or come in contact with, I noticed there was a lot of it's like existential themes, but also a lot of themes having to do with nature, like in the, Area X books, it's about like kind of nature reclaiming, like this section of land on their own terms. But also notice there was a lot of like fungal, like spores are something that comes up a lot in weird fiction for some reason.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you had any insight on that.
Well, you look at fungus itself. It's a very weird sort of life form. Mushrooms grow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of those mushrooms out there can send you to other planes of existence, and it's just a fungus, right? And if you look at the zombie ant fungus infection. I forget exactly where this is, but basically this fungus takes control over the ant and makes it do its bidding. It's terrifying, but it's real. So fungus itself is sort of most of it's harmless, but some of it isn't harmless at all, and some of it will help you realize who you are if you ever decide to ingest it. I'm not condoning drug use at all, but it's there, and it has some interesting effects on the human psyche, right? And so you have to wonder exactly what is this substance that can grow out of the darkest, because most of it grows from wastes, right? And so I think it's just the weirdness of the fungalness, the spores and what it can do to you. It is, but you're right. Like Jeff Vandermeer uses fungus a lot in his stuff. And Caitlin or Kiernan used it in the story that I'm going to talk about.
It's just good fodder for some weird stories.
And so it's very prevalent. I think it's like you pretty much nailed it by saying it's awesome food for thought. It makes for some great storytelling.
Yeah, one of the stories I have, is all about it. So, so you were saying this is a genre or a subgenre that's been around for a while. So for some of our listeners, what would you say are some of the classics that fall under weird?
For sure. Pretty much any horror writer from the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s, were weird writers. They were horror as a genre itself didn't exist back then. It was just considered weird fiction. And so if you had a ghost story, that was considered weird. And it wasn't considered as it might have been just considered as a ghost story, but it was also considered a weird story. But nobody ever said it was a horror story back then. I'm not too sure when the actual word horror was used as a genre, but so you got writers like M.R. James. I would highly suggest Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. That collection, it's all ghost stories, but it's considered weird fiction because of its root. Arthur Machen, The Great God Pan, that's definitely a weird fiction story. Algernon Blackwood, he has two of my favorites with the Wendigo and the Willows. And Robert Bloch, he's known for Psycho mostly.
Yeah.
But he started out, he was actually writing and corresponding with H.P. Lovecraft way back in the day. And he wrote for weird tales just like H.P. Lovecraft did. And so he started out writing cosmic horror type stuff. And then, of course, there's H.P. Lovecraft, which, except for Robert Bloch, all the other authors I just mentioned here were big influences on his own writing. And there's many others. I added Lord Dunsany on there, and then I took him off, and I probably shouldn't have, because he was sort of like the fantasy angle of weird fiction. And I think you could argue that the new weird of today is heavily influenced on that type of literature.
Oh, interesting. I know I have a short story collection by Robert Aickman.
Yes.
Yeah, on my Kindle I've been meaning to get to. But it was one of those stories that was just really heavy for this time in my life.
Oh, yes.
And very slow and very literary.
Yes.
I was like, I need to be in a different place to really get into this.
To read Aickman, you really have to be patient, because he's not going to come at you with all the flashing lights and stuff. A lot of his weirdness and the horrifying stuff that happens in his stories are very subtle. And if you blink, you might miss it. But then he has these other stories like The Sword. That story is just out there. Even for today, it transcribes really well. It aged very well. I love that story. It's one of my favorite short stories of all time because of just how weird it is.
I'll have to look into
Yeah,
it.
if you're going to read Aickman, I would suggest starting off with that. Because
I have the A Cold Hand in Mine.
Yes.
Is the collection I have.
It might be that one. I should.
I'll have to check it
Yeah,
out.
but
I know when we interviewed Kirsti DeMeester, she said he was a influence on her writing.
yes, I haven't read all his collections. He has five, I think. But I've read the majority of them, and like you, I kind of have to be in the mindset because not all of them are like the Sword. The Sword is the first one of his that I read, and it really, like, I was like, oh my god, this is awesome. But then you read a bunch of his other stories, and you're like, where did the Sword go? But so maybe it's not a good place to start if you're going to read Aickman, but
Maybe work up to the Sword.
yeah. And there's also, you can't talk about this stuff without mentioning Thomas Ligotti as well. He's,
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
I was going to say the story that I mentioned that I finished and I was so confused was the town manager.
Oh, yeah, from Teatro Grotesco, I think, is sort of a collection, sort of like a best of, if I have my facts right on that. But that whole collection is really dark and really weird. But then
Yeah.
Thomas Ligotti himself has a very dark sort of philosophy and I forget, is it ableist? No, antinatalist or something like that. Basically, he follows the philosophy that life is meaningless and there's no point in us being here, and that the earth and everything would probably be better without us. And it's very, so he sits down with these ideas floating around in his head, and he comes up with some very dark stuff. But his fiction, especially his earlier stuff, can be a lot like Aickman's, actually. It's very dense, very character driven, which a lot of it is anyway, but there's not much really all that weird happening. It's almost got like a David Lynch feel to it as well.
Interesting. Yeah, with the town manager, I remember it was a pseudopod episode I listened to.
Yes.
And I was like, this is great, very well written. I don't know that I got it. But I appreciate a story well told.
Yes. Yeah, Thomas Ligotti, he can be, you sort of need to be in the mood to read him.
Yeah.
Especially his darker stuff. You don't want to be going into that when you're already depressed.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Speaking of the influence of weird, it's definitely also made a presence in pop culture. So are there any films or adaptations that would be considered weird, like capital W weird?
Oh yeah, for sure. You can probably blame H.P. Lovecraft for a lot of the weird that bled into horror cinema, because even if it's not stamped all over it that this is an H.P. Lovecraft inspired story, you get other stories that still have that sort of element in it. But if you want something that's direct, especially with movies, The Thing, I think, is one of the best cosmic horrors. And this is the 1982 John Carpenter film. It's the best, I think, cosmic horror film out there. You can't hit the nail more on the head than that film. It's one of my favorite movies of all time as well. There's also like In the Mouth of Madness, another John Carpenter film. It's very much a H.P. Lovecraft story as well. You got like, I think it even takes place in Arkham, which is an H.P. Lovecraft town. But there's also stuff that's not necessarily like strictly H.P. Lovecraft. I'm thinking of The Mist. It's a very Lovecraftian story itself, but both the film and the novella by Stephen King, it's very much like a cosmic horror, weird fiction type thing. If you want to move away from the cosmic horror a little bit, there's Annihilation, the Jeff Vandermeer adaptation, although there's a lot of people who would argue that it is Lovecraftian, and it is to an extent, but I think especially the book is more his own thing. The movie sort of goes into like one of Lovecraft's stories, The Color Out of Space, I think it's called. And but the book kind of, it's less than that, if that makes any sense. It's not exactly quite like that. One thing that really brought a lot of people into reading H.P. Lovecraft is actually a D&D game called Call of Cthulhu.
Really?
Yeah. And this, like, I saw, once I was at the cable store for cable TV, and we were getting signed up for a new package of TV channels and whatnot, and internet. And the guy who was serving us had this giant Cthulhu tattoo on his forearm. And I was like, oh, you read H.P. Lovecraft? I thought this was awesome, right? And he was like, no, I play the game. It's like, I did read a couple of his stories because of that game, but that game is awesome. And I was like, oh, weird. You know, like, for me it was weird because I've never played it. But yeah. There's one that actually you brought up.
Yeah, I was thinking the Welcome to Night Vale podcast. I would say it's a fairly cosmic, because you do have like the older deities that like run the the news station. Yeah.
I listened to the first season, I think it was. That does seasons, right?
I think so, because I feel like there's certain times where I do get refreshed, like new episodes.
Yeah.
So I guess that makes sense that they do seasons.
Yeah, I enjoy that podcast too.
It's a good one. Also, another adaptation was I just saw Wounds on Hulu, which was an adaptation of the Nathan Ballingrud story. I don't remember what episode I mentioned it, but The Visible Filth. It was an adaptation of that, and that is very weird.
Yeah, I really want to see that, but I'm like Rachel. I live in Canada, and we don't get Hulu in Canada.
Oh, I was going to ask, so how do you guys get things like Castle Rock? Does it come on a different service, or is that just not?
Usually we just have to wait until it's on demand.
Huh.
So when Apple gets it or Google gets it, I'll usually rent it from there. Or sometimes another service, like another, like Netflix or something like that, will pick it up as well.
Interesting. But yeah, that was good. That had Armie Hammer and Dakota Johnson. Yeah, like it was good. And then the last 10 minutes, I was like, what is happening? Which seems on brand for...
Yeah, for sure.
Weird fiction.
That's the way it's supposed to be.
If you don't end the movie saying, what did I just watch?
Yeah. It's like everything was normal until the last 20 minutes.
I watched Annihilation on a plane because it was when it had just come out, and I think it got a theatrical release in the US and Canada, but it got like a Netflix release everywhere else.
Yeah.
And I was on vacation in Mexico. It had been released on Netflix Mexico, so I downloaded it so I would have it on the plane while I still had like Mexican Netflix. And yeah, it was very unsettling and a strange thing to watch on a plane.
Yeah.
It had a lot of like creepy, scary moments too.
It did, especially that bear.
The bear, the bear.
That thing is just, ugh. Even thinking about it gives me the shivers, you know? Screaming like a woman.
Oh, yeah.
And it's missing half its face. But yeah, that scene really sticks. It sticks in my head. That movie sticks in my head. I really enjoyed it. Actually, I enjoy the movie version more than the book, and that's not really insulting the book, honestly. The book is still good, I think, but I really enjoyed that movie. I think they brought more elements to it.
Yeah, I feel like, I think they also like humanize the characters a bit more, because in the book it's very hands off. Like, you don't really know anybody's name. Everyone is just their occupation. Like, the narrator is unnamed.
Yeah, that's very true. And they're almost like robots. Yeah.
But yeah, I need to rewatch that on like a real screen. That's not just like my phone on a plane.
I kind of wish I had been able to see it at the theater. Because just seeing something like that on a big screen would have been awesome.
Have you continued with any of the other Area X books?
Not yet, no. But I keep planning to. But you know how that is.
I'm like that too. Well, I started the second one and I was really taken aback because it takes place at the like Southern Reach offices, and it's like this weird like office politics corporate story, and I was like, what is what is this?
It's completely different.
Yeah,
because I did start it too. I made it until like the end of chapter 2 or something like that, and I put it down, not because I hated it or anything like that. It just wasn't hitting the spot, and so I moved on to something else. And I keep meaning to pick it back up with that in mind, knowing where it's going. And but I might do that this year, because this year I kind of want to finish reading some series that I'm in the middle of, and that would be a good one.
Oh, that would be a good one. I'll have to see if I can find it. I know Hoopla has like all of the books like together in one.
Oh, I have this compilation in physical form of all 3 books.
Oh, yeah?
So, an omnibus, as they call it.
We'll see.
Yeah.
I have a lot of like goals I put for myself for this year, so
Yeah, me
we'll
too.
see. Maybe one of them will be reading the next Area X book.
Yeah.
All right, so do we want to talk about some weird fiction books?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Okay, so the first book I want to talk about is a short story collection. It's North American Lake Monsters by Nathan Ballingrud. And this is actually also getting a Hulu adaptation, just like Wounds was adapted from The Visible Filth. So that'll be one I'm excited to see how this translates.
Oh, me too.
Well, because it's one of those things where a lot of these stories just kind of end on a, ambiguous, or like, how some stories just kind of end in the middle.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
So I can't remember if every single story is set in the New Orleans area. I know The Visible Filth was, but I feel like the majority of them are kind of set, in or around New Orleans. This was one that was very human also. Like, we are following all these people, and that's what I really connected with in this story, because I feel like it follows people who don't fit in for whatever reason, or they're in weird transitional parts in their lives. Like, you're following like a recently released convict who's like trying to connect with his wife and his daughter that he like hasn't seen for a few years, and is kind of trying to figure out his place, and they stumble upon this weird creature. Or a mom who's like now a single mom and kind of trying to figure out what is life.
Yeah.
In this place in my life. It's very human, despite the fact that there are seen or unseen creatures in all of this story. And I did have a few favorites. I loved Wild Acre. That's kind of a werewolf story, but it's more about the aftermath of a werewolf attack, and that's one that I really want to see adapted. You Go Where It Takes You, which is the one about the single mom, but it's about a waitress who brings one of her customers home, and he shows her that he has a trunk full of human skins that he says that he puts on. And that's like the middle of the story. That's not even the like punch ending. That is like right away you find that out.
Yeah.
And then the story like keeps going from there. So it was just very interesting, and I was surprised that I ended up enjoying the collection as much as I did, because I really just connected with all of these stories and all of these characters. And a lot of them were dark, or following people that you might not want to spend a lot of time. Things like that, and interesting people. Rating wise, I will say it's fairly room temperature. Like I said, these are stories about like creatures seen and unseen, but mostly about people and like very human problems and dark emotional decisions. So
Yeah.
very literary, very well written, and like I said, looking forward to seeing how this translates to the screen.
Awesome.
So that was North American Lake Monsters by Nathan Ballingrud.
Awesome. I have to admit, I have not read that one yet, but it's that and Wounds are both on my like high on my radar. I'm hoping to get to those this year as well, honestly, because of those Hulu shows when they're available.
Yeah.
I wanna eat them up. Speaking of short story collections, I read Swift to Chase by Laird Barron. Laird Barron, he's very much a complicated writer. This is his last collection of short stories that he released, I believe, in 2016. And all the stories in this one, I don't think he did this with any of his other collections, but these ones are all connected, and they all take place either in or they're either based in Alaska or Alaska haunts the story in some way, and also the character Jessica Mace plays a big role in almost every story. She's not in all the stories, but she's always there in one way or another. These stories all have a Baronesque language and characters. The stories hold the flavor of, basically like hard-boiled noir mixed with strong elements of dread and horror. But of course, there's going to be some, cult action as well. Laird Baron's characters typically are tough, and they don't bemoan hardships. And that's an interesting thing, because a lot of weird fiction has a lot of characters moping around, being sad about their situation in life. But Laird Baron doesn't do that. His characters are gritty and they're tough, but they can also show a lot of vulnerability too. So they're sort of well rounded in that way, but they're not. I think if you have read a lot of hard boiled fiction, you would probably mesh very well with Laird Baron's style, because he's got a real grittiness, and his language is just. Every story is almost like a piece of art, because he'll switch from tenses to, he'll be doing it in second tense, and then he'll move to third tense, and then he'll go to first tense, and it all makes sense as to why he's doing that within the story's boundaries. But, nobody does that. Nobody can get away with that.
Yeah, you have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And this collection is really heavy on that, actually. He takes that sort of style and he just went to town with it. And the stories themselves, I kind of struggle to define Baron's stories, because they sort of really need to reread Baron's stories to get a good grasp of exactly what's going on sometimes. But you get the basics. My favorites are LD50. That was a pretty interesting story. Termination Dust and Ardor were my favorites. The one thing I really liked about this anthology, or not anthology, collection, was how you mentioned in yours that there was the after effects of a werewolf attack. Well, Laird Baron actually plays around with the concept of werewolves and vampires in this book as well. And that's not something that you see too often in weird fiction, because those are like typical horror tropes. But you get these murders that are happening, and it's highly suggested, even though nobody says it, that, a werewolf is doing this stuff, because it's an animal attack in certain places where only people could really be, and, stuff like that. And there's also this weird story about a vampire and an old porno adaptation of Dracula. That was interesting.
Okay.
As for rating this book, I'm going to put it in room temperature as well. As I said, it has Laird Baron's signature voice, although I would say that this is my favorite of his collections. The stories are complex, and honestly, I find them hard to remember because of how they bounce around. All that tense shifting and that I mentioned really kind of throws you off when you're trying to remember exactly what the story is about. And so that sort of forces you to go back and reread it so that you can try to figure out what the hell is exactly going on.
He's an author I've been interested in, because the only work of his that I've read was his newer series that he put out, which is more straightforward noir.
The crime ones. Blood Standard.
With like the ex-mob enforcer.
Yeah.
So I really haven't delved into his older horror stuff at all.
Yeah.
But he's someone that gets recommended to me a lot.
Yeah, I would definitely try, especially if you want more horrific stories, try Occultation.
I was going to say that's the one I've had my eye on.
Yeah, or the Imago sequence. Those have some really exceptionally dark stories in them. This book doesn't exactly go there, but it has similarities, mostly in the style, in the way the stories were written. But But those stories, those older stories, they're definitely much more horrific than these ones were.
Interesting. So yeah, I'll have to check him out.
And that was Swift to Chase by Laird Barron.
My next one is The Beauty by Aliyah Whiteley. This is a novella, and this is this takes place in the future where all women have died. They all succumb to an illness that sprouts mushrooms all over them and kills them. So we are following a colony of men that live in the woods, and they kind of in like a commune situation. You know, they all pitch in and help each other. And we are following a narrator who is a teenage orphan, and his role within the commune is a storyteller and to kind of tell everyone what happened and history. And one day while he's walking through the woods, he comes across a woman who is made of mushrooms, and more mushroom women sprout up and start walking. They can't talk, but they can communicate with him telepathically, and he starts a romantic relationship with one of them, and a lot of the men starting relationships with the mushroom women, which causes a rift with the other men. And so it's like one of those things where the camp is kind of split. One group has readily accepted that, you know, this is maybe the next stage of human evolution, and like, who are we to fight it? And maybe this is just our new future. This is the new way of life. And, you know, the other group of men who think this is disrespectful to the memory of human women. And so, yeah, they're split on embracing the idea of them as women, and people are skeptical. I will say a lot of like body horror in this that I was not expecting. And so, some scenes that have been etched into my mind, especially going for like, how do we define what humanity is now, because with this new setup and romantic relationships, a lot of the roles are reversed biologically when it comes to procreation. So that was quite a sequence of paragraphs. So yeah, this was a very, very strange story. And the minute I picked it up, I'm like, yeah, this is weird. This is like very weird fiction. I will say it's room temperature with some disturbing body horror scenes. It's a strange short story, like I said, has got some gore. It felt like it was from a distance, and the violence did keep escalating, but I would still say it's a fairly room temperature. And that was The Beauty by Aliyah Whiteley. I told you I had a mushroom book.
Yeah. And now I got to go read it.
I think it's almost exactly 100 pages, so it's not much of a time commitment.
I really like the idea of that, of, women mushroom creatures.
Yeah.
And, because if the women are all gone, what do you do?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Just accept you're going to die out, I guess.
Yeah. Speaking of fungus, I read Borne by Jeff Vandermeer. Surprisingly, there's not very much in the way of fungus in this book, but I think it did make an appearance here and there. This story is basically about a planet, our planet, Earth, that has been ravaged by climate change. And we follow Rachel, not to be confused with our Rachel. Yeah. We follow Rachel, who's a survivor of this ruined Earth. She lives in a ruined city that never gets named. She lives in this apocalyptic world that's very, very alien to our world, but at the same time, it's familiar as well. Basically, she's a scavenger, and she it's like she goes looking for stuff just to survive. And one day while she's out, she this is what really makes it weird, and it kind of actually almost threw me off, this story, because she finds this creature that's clinging to the fur of a giant bear that likes to fly around the city and torment the survivors living in that city. And that just that to me just seems kind of, I don't know, far-reaching, you could say. But Jeff Vandermeer handles this very well, and this bear is terrifying, let me tell you. So he flies around the city ruins and he terrorizes its people. And she, like I said, while it was sleeping, she finds this little creature clinging to its fur, and so she saves it and brings it home. And that is Borne. I forget why they named it Borne, but they named it Borne. And the themes for this book are of family, parenting, and mother and son relationships. She forms a bond with Borne that is very mother and son like, and is one of my favorite parts of the novel. And also what love is and what sacrificing for love means. I did find that the prose for this book could weigh down the story by being a little bit too poetic and introspective when it didn't need to be. But otherwise, this is a very well written story that can go to some very dark and gory places at times. One of my favorites is the evil. There's evil children in this book, and that was a lot of fun. Having said that, my rating for this book, I'm just going to put as room temperature because while it had some horror elements, it just wasn't scary. Even though I mentioned that Borne was terrifying, I only mean that in my own sort of retrospective or thinking about it way. If there's this giant bear flying around the city and swooping down to eat you every so often, that would be terrifying. But the way Vandermeer portrays it, it's not really terrifying. It's handled very well and it's very well written. It's just not scary. And and as I said, my favorite part was the army of killer children. And that's where things
Flying bear, killer children.
yeah, and that's where things would get very gory. There's a lot of elements to this book. It's a short book as well. It's about 230 pages, but there's a lot that happens in it. And I recommend it if what I described sounds interesting. I think you should check it out. It's very different from the Annihilation series, but it's more similar to his older stuff, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's like someone you like have to mention, I guess, if we're talking the new weird, especially since he edits the like new weird anthologies, right?
For sure. This is definitely falls into that new weird category. It's almost like a China Mayville story in a way. And he's definitely like a big pioneer of the new weird as well. But yeah, it's definitely a great read. It's never boring, and I highly recommend it. And that was Borne by Jeff Vandermeer.
My final pick is The Cosmology of Monsters by Shaun Hamill. And what I found interesting about this story is that a lot of it could just read like a straightforward book you would read for a book club about like a family and like sibling tensions and generational drama. But then it has all this weird supernatural stuff put in. So, and the way that they were put together, I think makes a lot of sense to the story, but I just think it's funny to look and dissect all of that. So it's about literal and figurative monsters that haunt the Turner family. Like the story starts out in the 60s and you follow the mom, who is Margaret, when she meets Harry, who's a lover of H.P. Lovecraft and is like obsessive and collects all of his work and has all these comics. And against her better judgment, she marries him. And they have two daughters and they find themselves struggling financially, and they decide as a family to open a haunted house attraction as a family business.
Awesome.
And yeah, halfway through the story, you find out that the story is being told from the point of view of Noah, who's the youngest, and he sees a monster outside his window. And you see that in the beginning of the story, Margaret saw the same monster, but Noah like communicates with it and starts a relationship with it and what the repercussions are of that. And I really liked the way that this story played with time and with a reality and what you think you know. Stephen King described this as if John Irving ever wrote a horror novel, it would be something like this.
Awesome.
I loved it. So that's what I mean. It has all those weird elements, but it has all of those literary elements that I think you see a lot in big commercial, like, book club fiction. Like, this is the story of this family, and here are all the changes that happen to this family over the decades and generations. And as the children get older, you see like the patterns that they take on in their lives. And it's all of that plus Lovecraftian weirdness.
Mm-hmm. That sounds...
So I would say this is a good entry point for maybe someone who reads those kind of books and is interested in experimenting with some weird fiction. I would say this is maybe a good place to start because it's got a lot of those familiar elements.
I really like the John Irving angle, honestly, because I would love to see more John Irving weird fiction. Because
now we know there's a market for it.
His fiction is weird enough on its own.
I've actually never read anything. He's the one that wrote A Prayer for Owen Meany, right?
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah, I've never got around to it. I did watch the movie adaptation that he hated of it.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And that was pretty weird.
And if he heard me say that his fiction was weird, he'd hate me. So, because he once got mad at an interviewer for saying that his characters were offbeat and weird. And he was like, no, they're not. They're real. And I was like, okay.
Sure.
It's okay.
No, totally normal.
Yeah.
It's fine. Rating-wise, I would say it's room temperature. My favorite parts were about the family. Like, I really loved reading Margaret and Harry's story and, when they were dating and when they got married and kind of the early stages of their marriage and starting a family and settling down. Like, those are, like I said, normal things you see in a lot of contemporary fiction. And I very much enjoyed those. I also enjoyed, the weirder aspects of it. But yeah, this was a lot of fun, but I would say a fairly room temperature.
Awesome.
That was Cosmology of Monsters by Shaun Hamill.
Excellent. My final book was Agents of Dreamland by one of my favorite authors, Caitlin R. Kiernan. Now, Caitlin R. Kiernan is known not just for weird fiction, she's also known for her Lovecraftian type fiction. And this is definitely a cosmic horror story set in a Lovecraftian sort of style without it necessarily being Lovecraftian itself. So the story involves a guy, his name, as the only name you get to learn about, or what his name is the Signal Man. So the Signal Man is the main character. The funny thing about this book I found was that names of characters weren't necessarily important. And you kind of find that a lot in weird fiction. It's not about the person's name sometimes, especially in like cosmic horror. But this one is sort of falls into that sort of category. And what he does, he works for an agency, and it's never really defined exactly what the agency does, but we get the idea that they work for, or they investigate supernatural events and stuff that's going on. And I believe it's government-funded type of agency as well. I could be wrong about that. There's so much information that she throws at you. It's hard. This is another one that would be really beneficial if you were to reread it, because you know that you missed a lot of stuff. And so the one thing that I found is that this is kind of becoming a bit of a trope. And that's a good thing, I think, of an agency that looks into supernatural events and they continuously try to stave off the end of the world, and that's exactly what's going on in this book. But before I get into that, the Signal Man is a typical. The Signal Man, the character, he's a typical Kiernan character in that he's very much broken. I really enjoyed reading him because he's got the characteristics that I find entertaining in fiction, but really sad in real life. He's a broken character, and he's also an addict. He likes to drink a lot, even when he's working. And at the beginning of the story, the Signal Man meets a woman from another similar agency to his own. Her name is Sexton. I think she might be the only character that we actually learn their name. He meets her in a diner where he's seeking to make sense of something that happened on a case where when they went something that disturbed him. You know, he's been doing this job for a long time. He's seen a lot of weird stuff, but this really got to him. So he and his team basically stormed a cabin of cultists, and what they saw in there was something that Kiernan is very good at doing. She'll take you and she will make, without showing you exactly what's going on and what these characters see, she will make you feel how disturbed that they feel. And I really enjoyed that about this story, because you get a glimpse of what happened in that cabin, but you don't see it, if that makes any sense. And I really enjoyed that about the book. Because you didn't get to see it doesn't mean that you don't get to experience the effect it had on the signalman. So he sees her, and basically what the story is coming down to is that the end of the world is coming, and there's basically nothing you can do to stop it this time. And it involves what we were talking about earlier, the that fungus that attacks ants, the zombie ant fungus. Mm-hmm. And basically this is a fungus that does something similar to humans, and it sort of makes dimensions collide, and that's pretty much all I understood. But
you got so much more out of it than I did. So.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really difficult to discuss, because while you're reading it, you sort of, at least with me, I was like, okay, I think I understand exactly what's going on here, but maybe not. And then you go to discuss it, and you're like, okay, you know what? So when I went to write down my notes for this book, I was like, like, where do I start? I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of confusing, but at the same time, it's fascinating. I really, like, it had me looking up the zombie ant thing. I heard about that before, but I never looked it up. But while I was reading the book, I stopped and I went and looked up zombie ants. And let me tell you, that's terrifying. There's another thing I wanted to mention. Sexton, the other agent, she can travel through different periods of time via her own experiences. So it's almost like a predestination thing is happening in this book, because she can go into the future, her future self, and she can go to her past self. And so you have to wonder, is there like a present self, or is she like all these selves in one? And that gets confusing all on its own.
Yeah.
So I felt this was a really cool story, and I'm definitely going to reread it again, because, as I said, there's so much going on, and I believe it's the first of a trilogy. The next one is called Black Helicopters, and I bought it immediately after reading this one. And my rating for it is I was going to put it in the fridge, but then I thought about the zombie ants, and so I put it in the freezer, because that's some terrifying stuff in my opinion. Kiernan, she's a master at creating disturbing imagery with her descriptions. The fungus in this story is definitely one of her most interesting creations, I'd say. And if listeners out there don't know what the zombie ant is, I highly suggest you research that stuff, because it's terrifying. Or read this book, because Kiernan actually describes in detail what that fungus is. And I found myself both fascinated and ready to, go to the bathroom in fear, and, the cold sweats. And
yeah, that sounds like nightmare fuel.
It is nightmare fuel, and I loved it, so I would recommend it wholeheartedly. Just prepare to be confused. I would leave it at that. And
yeah,
and that was Agents of Dreamland by Caitlin or Kiernan.
Well, good. We ended on a freezer book and a episode full of room temperature stories. So I feel like something for everyone.
Well, it almost made it to the fridge, but it was those darn zombie ants. Yeah.
Right, now for some chilling obsessions. So chilling obsessions are something in horror that we've been enjoying lately. it doesn't necessarily have to be something new that has just come out. That's often the case for me. Sometimes I watch movies that came out forever ago, which is the case this week. I finally got around to watching Green Room, which was a movie that came out in 2015. It got a lot of buzz. And I watched this because I listened to the Horror Virgin podcast, which was a chilling obsession from a previous episode. And that's the podcast where a group of friends make their friend that doesn't like horror watch a horror movie every week. And so this was the one they were doing. And I was like, I'll watch it with them and listen to the episode. And I ended up really liking it. I thought this was going to be a lot scarier than it was. So this is about a punk band that is on a low budget tour. They're very down on their luck and need money. They perform at a neo-Nazi club. They do know this before going in, but they're very much like, whatever, like we'll perform, we'll get paid, and we'll get out of there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it does not end up going that way because one of the band members leaves her phone in the green room, and as one of the band members goes out to get it, when they're leaving, he witnesses something he should not have seen. And they have decided that they cannot leave now. They have seen too much. And so they barricade themselves in the green room, and it's them versus these neo-Nazis who are led by Patrick Stewart, weirdly.
That is weird.
It's like the head skinhead. So this was really good, really tense, and I would say something I could watch with my husband because it really didn't have a lot of supernatural elements. It was pretty straightforward and just like a really tense thriller in a way. So not something that I would say is like just for horror fans. And I would say in this episode, not weird at all. not any weirdness. Very dark.
Yeah.
Very sad. But yeah, not a lot of like weird elements. It's a pretty straightforward story, but very good. I was impressed with the storytelling, and it starred the late Anton Yelchin. I think that was his last movie.
Oh yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Aliyah Shawkat from I don't know how to say her last name. Shawkat, maybe from Arrested Development.
Yeah.
And so that was a Green Room.
I haven't seen that film, but it's one that's on my radar. It's weird because I find time for books and that. And, I come from a heavy movie watching history. And lately, ever since I've had my my little guy in my life, I just don't have time to watch these movies anymore because I have to watch them late at night and I'm usually too tired. Yeah. But I know. I relate to that because now my son's at the age where like he wants to know what's happening on the screen and he gets scared. Yeah.
Like when they're babies, like they don't know what's going on and you can just watch whatever.
That's true.
It's when they start like realizing.
Yeah. Why did he do that?
I can't watch.
Yeah.
I can't watch this stuff with you.
Yeah. That's true. But I did get a break over the Christmas holidays to watch a movie that came out recently. And that was The Lighthouse with Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. Oh. And it also has a woman actor in it. Her name is Valeria Karaman. Huh. She has a very small role, though. It's basically Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson throughout the whole thing. It's basically, and this is, I imagine that this is true. That the story is based on these two lighthouse guys. It's basically like the leader and the guy who's his servant, basically his assistant. And they go on to an island of rock, and they stay there for 2 weeks. That's their guard for the lighthouse, and they have to basically just take care of the lighthouse and keep it up. And also, shine the light out at night so they can help guide boats. And some weird things start happening. The story is pretty much told from Robert Pattinson's character. And you come to realize, and I don't want to get too far into this because I have my theory as to what happens in this film. And I'm just going to leave it at that his character, it's told in his perspective, but you can't rely on his perspective. at all. He's very much, what's that term called? Very unreliable narrator. There's, and this is where Valeria comes in, because there's mermaids in it. And
Okay.
yeah, and they're not friendly mermaids, and obviously it comes into question whether or not they're even real. But the story itself is told it's in black and white, and there's some, just if you take out the weird dark stuff, there's still some weird stuff going on, if that makes any sense. Because Willem Dafoe, he takes the night shift, so he's up in the lighthouse, and there's a scene where he's naked and reaching for something, and you just don't know what the hell he's doing. And you gotta wonder if the director, who's also one of the writers, Robert Edgars, you have to wonder if they were just doing that for style, or for to keep you guessing. It was a very, very odd story, and I enjoyed it, though. It kept me, even though, because Robert Edgars, he did The Witch, and that story, you really need to pay attention, and that's sometimes hard to do. This, because of its slow pacing, is very much a slow burn. This movie is very much a slow burn as well, except that there's so many odd things happening that you're sort of got your eyes glued to the screen. And I really enjoyed it. I would recommend it if you want to see something that's a little out there, a little bit off the wall, and something that'll keep you guessing, and might even keep you guessing after you've watched it. And that was the Lighthouse.
That's on my to-watch list, so and we were talking, I don't get to get out much, so I will be waiting for that when it comes to streaming.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's a very
to watch.
It's a very dark film, both visually and concept. There's some, it's definitely out there. It's weird. It falls into, it's kind of cool that I watched that, because it definitely falls into the weird fiction spectrum, I think. And it's just a lot of fun.
Books in the Freezer is a bi-weekly podcast. We post episodes every other Tuesday. You can find us on Twitter at BooksFreezerPod, on Instagram at Books in the Freezer, or at Facebook.com/BooksInTheFreezer. You can send us an email at booksinthefreezer@gmail.com. Show notes for this episode and all previous episodes are at booksinthefreezer.com. We are also on Patreon as Books in the Freezer, and there's different rewards for all of the different tiers. If you are at the Final Girl tier, you get the episodes on Sunday instead of Tuesday, and you get to know what the topic is the week before the episode comes out. $3 Patreon supporters can be part of the Voxer group, and you get to ask questions first when I have author interviews, among other things. Malevolent spirits get all of those things, plus monthly bonus episodes. So check us out there. There are a lot of ways to support the podcast, and one of them is leaving a review for us on Apple Podcasts. And we also recently became Amazon affiliates, so if you do make a purchase on Amazon, be sure to use our link. The coolest things that were bought using our link this week was somebody pre-ordered Wonderland by Zoya Stage, which was featured on the new releases episode that came out last week. And also somebody bought some men's running shoes. So
very cool.
So yeah, if you're going to make a purchase on Amazon, consider using our link before you do that. I'm Stephanie. You can find me on Twitter at lady_Ganya, or on Instagram at That's What She Read, and that's with 2 A's, or on YouTube as That's What She Read. Where can people find you, Jason?
Well, you can find me on my YouTube channel. Just search Jason's Weird Reads. I come up tops on that, which is nice. But, when I first started, I typed in Jason's Weird Reads and I couldn't find myself. But anyways, yeah, you can find me at Jason's Weird Reads on YouTube. And you can also find me on Twitter at Jason_White74. And that also there's my podcast, the Darkness Dwells podcast, but right now we're sort of on a hiatus because of some scheduling issues, but hopefully we'll get back to that later in the year. And that's pretty much it for me.
So yeah, be sure to check that out. And again, thank you so much for coming on the show, Jason, and talking weird fiction with me, because it's something I wasn't like super familiar with. So this was a fun conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I absolutely love talking about this type of stuff, and I hope I didn't gab your ear too much.
No. It was great. Well, like I said, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.